Hi there. The following is a presentation which I have given at many churches, hospitals, and around, or certain varieties of this presentation. And my hope here is that I can help those who are grieving to understand a little more about the bereavement process and how they are reacting relative to some sort of normality. The first slide I want to share with is from a woman whose husband was killed in an automobile accident years ago. And I thought that she wrote a very simple yet profound summary of how grieving people should be treated and how grieving people need to have their family and friends understand them. She used to hang this on her, or she had hung this on her refrigerator as a reminder to people. The first thing she said is, "Please talk about John even though he is gone. I need to talk about him. I need to do it over and over." So many people who are grieving do need to speak about their loved ones. And it's kind of the elephant in the room situation that when people are with them, they don't know. Their friends, for example, may not be sure. Should I bring up, the deceased or shouldn't I? And so what she's mentioning to us is very clear that we ought to do it. The second thing she says is, "Be patient with my agitation. Nothing feels secure in my world." The death of a loved one, particularly a spouse or a parent, can seem very, very unsettling, and the security of having a given relationship now is at jeopardy. That security has now been taken away, and so the world can seem very much upside down. She says, "Don't abandon me with the excuse that you don't want to upset me." I have heard this from so many people, and that is that when friends don't call, or other family members don't call, and when they eventually talk, they said, "Oh, I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't want to upset you." Lori was quite upset and says, "I really felt abandoned by them in my deepest time of need." And I have to agree that nowadays there's so many ways on the internet and others to find out how to help grieving people, that I find that more or less the people who aren't calling are more or less concerned by them for themselves than they are for the grieving person. Lori says, "Get comfortable with my crying. Sadness hits me in waves and I never know when my tears might flow." In other words, I don't know how I'm going to be doing, but if you're going to spend time with me, don't be surprised if I get sad, because crying is a natural way to handle this grief. She also says, if you're ever wondering how to help a grieving person, just sit with me in silence and hold my hand. Don't try to explain it. Don't try to make any kind of comments that would help me understand maybe why this happened. Just be a presence and just be there and hold my hand. Just because I look good does not mean that I feel good. Ask me how I feel only if you have time to find out. The first part is simply saying that many people put on a front for the general public and for family and friends, but the reality is they're not necessarily doing that great on the inside. How often have people told me that, a friend might say to them, "Oh, you're looking good today." And of course, they're upset by that only because maybe they felt they mustn't have looked good yesterday. Or not only that, but they know inside that they're not really feeling good, but they're pretty much acting. Ask me how I feel. Now, this one says basically that don't sit and go, "How you doing?" kind of thing. And then if I start to tell you or I start to cry, that you run to another meeting or you say you have another commitment. If you're going to ask that question, be prepared to spend some time to have the person tell you how they're really doing. My grieving may only begin a few months after John's death. Don't think that I'll be over it in a couple of months. My whole world has crumbled and I will never be the same. So what she's saying here is that, It's going to go on for a long time, and in the subsequent slides I'll be talking a lot about the time frame. And lastly, she has some good advice. Spread the word about what I need. So few people know what to do, and yet I haven't the strength to teach everyone. So the grieving person, in my opinion, knows often far more how to help them than the average person does. But unfortunately, a lot of other people think they know better than the grieving person themselves. And we'll talk about that more as well. I don't have to tell a grieving person this, but the bereavement process is very much like a roller coaster. Sometimes we can have extreme mood changes all in the same day, all in the same hour, in fact. Sometimes we might seem like we're overly happy, then all of a sudden we're sad, and then we're back up and down again. And to people who feel that they're pretty stable in their lives, this can be very upsetting, or this can be very unsettling, I guess, that they might feel like their life is now altogether a mess, and they are themselves a mess. Physically, grieving can be very exhausting and can be very painful. Mentally, we're overwhelmed. We'll talk about these things in more specifics later. Our behavior becomes very confusing and unpredictable. And spiritually, we can start to really question our belief in God, or maybe our belief in whatever it is that we did believe in. But the death of a loved one can often lead us to have questions about life itself. Some feelings and misunderstandings that we'll run into. A lot of people will say something like, am I going crazy? Am I okay? I don't feel like I'm acting the way I normally do. This is very common, and it's very, again, unsettling, but it's also, as I say, very common and understandable because so many people, are so overwhelmed by what's going on. Why does it still hurt so badly? Well, the reality is we know why it hurts so badly, because the more we love someone, the harder it is, or the more hurt that's going to take place, or the longer a couple maybe have been together, the harder it's going to be when one of them dies. The true question I think most people are really asking when they say, why does it still hurt, is will it ever get easier, which is the next question. The truth of the matter is, yes, it does get easier, but not at the time frame that most people would like. This is not an instant solution problem. We are very used to things happening quickly and maybe being resolved quickly, but grief doesn't really have such a quick reaction, or doesn't have a quick response to solve this problem. Is it okay to cry so much? Absolutely, positively. Crying is the solution. Crying is the medicine for grieving and for this bereavement process. People who are used to crying can find this easier than some who might have been raised that you should never cry. And this is particularly true with a gender bias, where men are probably, or boys, are raised more to be told not to cry than girls or women. But the reality is, when a death of a loved one occurs, crying is what we should be doing if we need to. Are others getting tired of my sadness? Yes, frankly, they probably are. But the problem is, they shouldn't be thinking you should be done with your sadness. And at the same time, you probably should understand that some people may not be really interested, if you want to go down that path, interested of spending a lot of time with sad people. So I tell people all the time that one of the most common questions I get for doing this bereavement counseling, which I've done for now over 20 years, is asking me why or how I can deal so much with sad or crying people. A myth or misunderstanding, if you will, is that time heals all wounds. Time does play a role, but time alone does not take care of this. We're going to talk a lot about time in the next few slides. I can handle this alone, or I don't want to be using medication. Some people can handle these things alone, but most people need a good friend or a good family member to discuss their grief with. And many people could benefit from some sort of anti-anxiety or antidepressant medication for, maybe a 6-month or a year period. And I just suggest that if a physician recommends it, that you consider taking it. And if you're not sure if you should, maybe reaching out for a second opinion. But I have seen a very strong benefit for so many people who have started to take some sort of medication after the death of a loved one, and it has worked out quite well for them. Lastly, people say what I'm going to call dumb things. And what I mean by that is they're not really sensitive to where you're coming from. For example, you need to move on. You need to get out more, or she's in a better place. Now, what I'm going to tell you is that when people recommend things you do, this is going to sound sarcastic, but it's true. For the most part, I would recommend doing the opposite. Because, see, I think a lot of people who are making these recommendations are recommending what you do, thinking that it will help you. I believe they probably have your best interest at heart. But they're also thinking, if I can get him or her out of this sad place, they'll be a lot easier for me to deal with. And so a lot of it has to do with the friend who's suggesting these things, trying to protect themselves as well. So for example, you need to move on. Well, what the heck does that really mean, right? You've been married for 50 years and it's now been 7 months and someone's telling you that you should just pretend that you weren't married for 50 years and just move on. You need to get out more. Well, not really. Grieving, this bereavement process, is really an inward thing. It really is something that people deal with internally, and going out and getting distracted from it every so often might be a good thing. But in general, you're better off by staying home, or having a close friend come over to your house where you can talk about things, you can cry if you need to, and such that you're now really beginning to heal rather than just putting it off for a later date. And lastly, I have no doubt that certain people who die, and since I have a strong belief in faith in heaven, etc., that he or she might be in a better place. But the problem is not where they are, the problem is where they're not. And so sometimes people will read, if someone says, just like she's in a better place, a grieving person can interpret that as almost a smack in the face, like, okay, stop grieving, she's in a better place, why are you so upset still, etc., etc. So just a comment on bereavement, just to give you an idea. Anyone going through it understands that it's a time of transition. I use the word bereavement and sometimes grief interchangeably because really bereavement is grief due to the death of a loved one, whereas you could also be grieving the loss of a job, you could be grieving the loss of a relationship, divorce, etc. And all of these grief reactions are very similar, and frankly, a lot of what I'm saying here about the bereavement process and how to handle it could very easily apply to other grief reactions as well. Bereavement is a time defining what used to be and what will be. We know it's a very uncomfortable and can be a very painful time in our lives. I'm going to suggest just very simply, it's easy for me to say this, but it's important to give in to the feeling of that loss, meaning that, as I said earlier, it just doesn't work to pretend that I'm doing okay. I think a great example, one time I helped a young man whose father died, and he had just gotten his PhD in physical therapy. And what was interesting is how similar we realized the process of physical therapy and grief therapy was. And what I mean by that is just imagine that you broke a leg, for example, but you used to love to dance. And so you get home, you've had surgery on your leg, you're beginning some physical therapy, and a friend of yours says, just get up and start dancing, or don't do that physical therapy. That's not necessary. Just sit on the couch and you'll feel better. Well, the reality is, if you don't go through the pain of the physical therapy, and if somehow you think you can just get up and start dancing again, you see, everything's going to backfire and going to blow up on you. And this process is very similar. We can't just pretend it's not there. We can't just jump up and imagine a life without the loved one as it was before. And so this is part of the reason why it takes so long, the grief process, because we need to go from what we used to have to learning how we're going to now be in the future. And it is this time, basically, when we look at what we used to have or what is now over, that particular relationship, but what isn't over. And often when a death occurs, people early on in the process will have a sense in their life that they've lost everything, that they'll never be able to move forward, etc. That's very normal. But over time and with some help, people will start to find out that, yes, I did lose a lot, but it's not everything. And now I have to find a way to move into my new life in a different configuration than it was before, but it's not all lost as badly as I thought it was in the very early days of this grief process. So what are some of the factors, and I won't go through every one of these in detail, but what are some of the factors that affect our grieving or our bereavement process? So some of them are more obvious than others. So for example, who the person was. Was it your child? Was it your remote grandmother? Was it your husband or wife? So obviously the nature of the attachment, as I say here, is very important. How strong a relationship did you have? Did this person provide you with a secure feeling? I took care of a woman one time whose husband was a police officer. She never felt nervous, but when he died, she said, "Oh my goodness, I don't know how to take care of myself, or I'm afraid," because he was always there to protect us. Some relationships have ambivalence in them. Some people aren't really overly caring for one another, or some relationships are kind of neutral at best. Some relationships even have conflicts. I've had people tell me that, and this is going to sound sad, but when their spouse died, they were happy because they had such a horrible relationship and almost abusive relationship. Now this is what's reported to me. I don't know, of course, the details, but that the person felt some sort of relief coming out of that. And then how much dependency did you have on the person who died? There are codependent personalities. There are people that very much rely on other people, and there are other people who are very independent in that regard. So of course, it's the relationship as well as the grieving person, how they're going to respond. An interesting one that people ask me about all the time is it better, and think about this question really, but I understand it. Is it better to have someone die suddenly or a long illness? And I think I know what they're asking me is the grieving process different. And I have to tell you from my experience, the grieving process in time and in how it manifests itself is very similar. What is different is the focus. So in other words, people who have lost a loved one, like in a car accident or something, suddenly totally focus on how they didn't get to say goodbye, what could they have done differently so the person wasn't driving then, etc., that type of thing. Whereas someone who has gone through a long illness with a loved one and then that loved one dies often will be more focused on going back and visiting the initial diagnosis and sort of reliving that dying process, because it didn't, even though it was sudden when they finally died, it wasn't as sudden as a car accident, but there were so many other things that they didn't really pay attention to, many decisions they made, and then questioning, was this the right thing to do, or should we have done more, all those kind of things. So the bottom line is, I don't think there's a big difference. The other thing is proximity, and what do we mean here? And that is that if it's a loved one that lives on the West Coast and we're on the East Coast of the United States, that's not nearly as hard to handle as someone who might be living down the street from you. Part of that's because it's harder to have such a close relationship from a distance. But it has also been seen when the Challenger, years ago, when the Challenger space shuttle blew up, there was a study done and showed that clearly children on the East Coast who were closer to where that teacher was from, and more in a real time when this occurred, had a much more difficult time than children on the West Coast. Other factors are what other losses we might have had, and by other losses, I don't just mean deaths. As I said, it could be a divorce, it could be relationships, it could be many different types of losses. How are we at coping in the first place? What is our normal style? And what are the kind of things that we're used to doing? What are the support systems? This is very important. Something I always try to find out about is, does the grieving person have other family or close friends around, or they're going to be very isolated? I live now down in southern Florida, and you find a lot of retired people down here. So what happens is when a husband or wife dies, particularly, often that person could be down here by themselves because maybe they moved down a few years ago from up north and really haven't established a lot of family, established a lot of friends, and maybe they don't have an awful lot of family down here also. And then lastly, what other stresses are in the person's life? Are there financial stresses already? Now a death of a loved one makes the person even more worried, like, how am I going to afford to live? Or is my house too expensive? Maybe there's already difficulties within the family structure, and so now these stresses are being overlaid on top of the death of a loved one. So time frame. This is one that I like to make sure people get to hear, because this is probably one of the most most non-understood or most not understood elements of the grief time frame or the grieving time frame. So my first caveat is there's only averages. I don't mean anyone's death of a loved one is average. But at the same time, if you were to take 1,000 people and sort of look at what's going on in their life after the death of a loved one, this would be what you typically see. For the most part, most people take something on the, something around the idea of a year or two to respond to a normal loss. Normal loss meaning that condo that just collapsed in Miami or on the East Coast, that wasn't a normal loss. That was a very traumatic experience for the whole public. So there's an awful lot of other factors. So the normal process is that the first few months, there is an awful lot of numbness. People will tell me that they didn't think it was as hard to deal with this death as they thought it would be. They'll maybe say things like, I went to the funeral, I know I was there, but I'm not sure I really participated. I kind of feel like I might have even been hovering around it. This is just kind of very normal for people. The body sort of kicks in like a natural anesthesia to protect the person. 3 to 6 months after the death of a loved one, and more toward the 6, probably even than the 3, is when the pain really starts to get worse. Now, most people would think the pain would probably be the worst in the first couple of weeks, but that's not the case. The pain really starts to intensify as we approach that kind of 6-month time frame. There are many reasons why this starts to happen, including the support from others just goes away, right? I mean, a grieving person has more lasagna than they know what to do with for the first month maybe. But 6 months, they're pretty much back on their own. It's been a long time since that it is a long time without their loved one, and probably never were apart for that long. If it was a college kid that died, they may have been away for college for a few months, but never 6 months. So there's just a lot of things that add up to making this a very difficult time. Many people start to see that they're coming out of the deep, painful time from 6 to 12 months after the death. And then usually the second year after the death of a loved one is when people are readjusting to that life now in this new way. That first year is awful hard also because of the fact that virtually every month there's some type of anniversary, there's Mother's Day, there's Father's Day, there's birthdays, so a grieving person for that first year really never has the opportunity to get a break. There's always something coming up, which is an important day over the next, 4 to 6 weeks or something to that effect. Interesting work has been done to look at these traumatic deaths, as I'm calling them, or I'm just kind of label them celebrity deaths, meaning that lots of people know about them. And as I said here, Oklahoma City, September 11th, and not putting it at the same level, but even something like this condo that just collapsed, people have reported that it wasn't until like the second or third year that they were even feeling at their worst. And a lot of that has to do with there's so many times that the press starts playing videos of what happened, coming to an anniversary of it or whatever. And so the grieving person never really gets a good chance to start the grieving process and continue, because every time they go back and show the event, it sort of slams that grieving person back to the day that it happened. And then that grieving process tends to have a feeling like it's starting all over again. So how do we cope? What are some things that we can do? And if anyone ever has questions, or I have lots of material I could send you, I posted my email address and I will post it again at the very end here. What are some negative approaches to coping with the death of a loved one? Well, some people just start to eat poorly. It's not the end of the world. It's just that, we start eating comfort food. Usually those aren't healthy foods. And if we start thinking of our grieving process a little bit like we have the flu or something, we start to recognize that, eating healthy is another good way to make us, heal better. Excessive staying in bed is another one. I mean, obviously, every so often, if a person just doesn't feel like getting up and they just need to lie in bed for a day, no different than if you had the flu or whatever, that's not a problem. But really depressed people, or people who are really getting deeply depressed, might stay in bed for, a week at a time. They're not showering, they're not feeding the animals. It can really get bad. And so if you start to feel you're slipping into that, you really ought to be seen by a physician. Drugs, when I say drugs, I don't mean legal medications, but other kind of drugs, and excessive use of alcohol. A glass of wine or two a night before you go to sleep or something's not what I'm talking about. But drinking a bottle of bourbon every night to just sort of bury your woes is, don't forget alcohol is a depressant. So if you're already depressed and you start drinking, it just frankly makes it worse, other than maybe if it knocks you out, it might feel better. Some people, particularly younger people, start doing things like cutting themselves or inflicting pain upon themselves, which has all sorts of reasons for why this happens. And then probably the worst example of not coping well is taking one's own life. And sadly, I've dealt with numerous cases where a person who has lost a loved one or a child have taken their own life as a result. More positive coping are sharing the way you feel, sharing your emotions with a good listener. That good listener could be family, could be friends, could be a counselor or, a clergyman. But the problem is you want to make sure, or the issue is you want to make sure the person you're speaking with has a good way of listening and helping rather than trying to talk you out of the way you're feeling. And if you can't share your feelings with someone directly, the next best thing is by journaling. And journaling or writing things down is a very effective technique for getting these horrible thoughts out of our heads. The journaling can could take place by simply writing down anything that comes to your mind that upsets you. It could be writing a story of your life together. It could be many different things and take on many different forms. But the idea is that when these painful thoughts or these things that are floating around inside our head are in there, they need to come out somehow. And so journaling and by writing them down, that's similar to talking about them, which are both more effective than just thinking about them. Some people have written letters to the deceased, and I've used this technique for resolving certain things. I was just talking to someone the other day who said there were certain things they really wanted to communicate to the deceased that they wish they could have said. And I suggested this technique that they do that, where you write a letter. That could be done in one of two forms, or looked at in one of two forms. One is that you believe from a spiritual point of view that they really understand what you're writing. The deceased really somehow is able to communicate, or at a minimum to comprehend what is being said. And the other way is just simply, that you're doing this to make yourself feel somewhat better and to get some of these things out. Counseling, obviously a grief counselor is a very good thing if that's what you need. Reading can sometimes be helpful, but we have to remember that reading is much more of an intellectual experience. In other words, it deals with our brain, and most of the grief that we're experiencing is dealing with our heart. So don't be surprised if you take up a lot of books on reading and grief and they don't seem to make things any better, because there's no, as I said earlier, there's no Amazon solution where you can just go onto your phone and order a book today and you read it tomorrow, and by the weekend you're better. That there's just doesn't happen. Physical exercise is good. Anytime we're really struggling, maybe to go out and take a little bit of a walk and sort of pull ourselves back together. Like if that happened while you were at work and you needed to take a 5-minute break, then you do that. But then I would really recommend that when you get home that day or sometime in the future, you put yourself back into whatever you were thinking about, and you then journal about it, so that you don't just suppress that, but you actually call it back up and you deal with it. Some sort of inward type of meditation or prayer can be very helpful, and some people can express their grief very beautifully through artwork. Music, if you play an instrument, that can be very good also. But at the same time, sometimes music can be overly emotional because we never realize how many songs are out there that you hear on the radio or somewhere else where they remind you of the deceased. So music can also be a little bit difficult if in a sort of a lack of controlled environment. So, what are some of the reactions in how we feel? Obviously, sadness. A lot of times people can feel angry. Sometimes they have things or people to be angry at for the death of a loved one, and other times it's just a generic anger that they need to place somewhere. Often guilt can be a feeling that grieving people express and experience. They may feel guilty about many things, including maybe I didn't do enough, or maybe I could have helped more, I should have called more, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, if the person is alone, they can experience loneliness or they can experience anxiety. It can be very difficult if you're not used to being on your own, and then you're worried and you're scared about your finances. So it can be a very anxious time. The grieving process is very tiring. So a lot of times people will report that their physical fitness is nothing like it used to be. Even marathon runners will say they can barely go out and jog. So, just understand that it's a tiring experience. Not only is it just depressing, and which causes fatigue, but you're preoccupied. There's so many things you need to do, and then you're trying to fight off the sadness, and so it can be extremely tiring. You can have a feeling of helplessness. You could still be in a sense of shock. You could be yearning. You could be wanting the person back. I've had people for months and months and months tell me, I still want the person back. I still can't believe the person is gone. And so that experience can go on for a long time. Sometimes, as I said earlier, people can feel emancipated. They can feel free or relief. Now, why would you feel those things? Well, if someone was very ill for a long period of time, all of a sudden, and you were the caregiver, you weren't able to go out without arranging for coverage. You couldn't go to the store. You couldn't do different things. What sometimes people will say is that, they realize that, holy cow, I can now do things that I never did before. Of course, as soon as you have that feeling, people feel guilty immediately. So it goes from that feeling of emancipation, feeling of being free, to a feeling of guilt. There is some natural feeling of relief after watching someone die for a long period of time, that this sad illness they had, not that you wish that on anybody, but now it's over. And again, there can be a terrible feeling of guilt after you experience that relief. But at the same time, please know that that feeling is normal. And lastly, as we talked about in the beginning, sometimes people just feel this numbness for a long period of time. What about physically? Well, physically, in that feeling in the pit of your stomach, how this pain hurts so bad. We can have tightness in the chest and throat. And if you ever have either of those chest or throat issues, please make sure you see a physician. It could be as simple as the anxiety and the grief, but of course it could be something much worse as far as your heart and others are concerned. So please make sure that you get to a doctor. Oversensitivity to noise and light. Sometimes people don't recognize this one, but they do once I write it down. Is grieving people tend to not want to be overly stimulated. So you'll see grieving people wearing sunglasses a lot. Sometimes it's to, cover the teary eyes, but a lot of times it's just that they need to protect their eyes from the bright light. mothers, a young mom whose husband maybe died and the kids are, just being kids and are noisy and stuff, will report back how hard it is to just hear them crying or screaming, which would have been very normal in the past. You could be short of breath. As I said, you could be very tired or find yourself in a lot of weakness. You could be really lacking energy. And, sometimes people report even dry mouths and a hard time speaking, and they're thirsty all the time. These are all the kind of reactions that people can have when they're grieving physically. Some of the thoughts that can go on, some of our thought processes, we can still just not believe it. And this is very common. I just still can't believe it. Nothing really feels, I'm just sort of in a time warp right now. It just seems like my life is on hold and nothing, it's just not happening. You hear people saying things like that. There can be a lot of confusion. They can be very lost as far as remembering appointments or what they needed to do. So your memory can feel like it's all messed up. This is common, and for people who were a little scatterbrained, if I can say it in the first place, this doesn't bother them so much. But for someone in the thought they had their act together, and this can really be upsetting, and it doesn't last forever, but it can really be a bit of a hard thing to deal with in the short term. Preoccupation, a lot of times people will just simply say, I can't stop focusing on the death. I can't stop focusing on those last few days, or I can't stop focusing on how am I going to survive without this person. So, part of the reason why your short-term memory and all your other distractions are happening is because of this preoccupation. You're just so caught up in, what's going on. Some people will report that they feel a sense of presence, that their deceased loved one is near them. They may see them, they may hear them, they may feel like they can smell them close to them. Whatever it is, it's a very common reaction. And sometimes it goes to the point where maybe it's getting a little beyond what would be normal into some sort of hallucination. So, which could be a sign of just normal brain function, and it could be a sign of something worse. So I just suggest to people that if they start believing they're seeing a lot of things, to talk to a professional, whether it be in the psychology field or in the medical field, just to make sure that it's just sort of the grief process, which is, helping them to have these type of visions. As far as behaviors are concerned, many people say it's awfully hard to sleep. The darkness is very hard for people. A lot of times people toss and turn or can't sleep at night, and then they're dead tired and sleep all day. Appetite wise, you may not feel like eating at all sometimes when they're grieving. That's the irony of, frankly, all this food that's brought to people early on, is most of the grieving people early on aren't going to eat anything, and that's the time when people bring them tons of food. Frankly, the thing that would be smarter for churches and other organizations that want to reach out would be to bring grieving people food like after 3 or into the 6-month time period, and go spend some time with them when it would be expected to be very difficult on them. We said before, you can get very absent-minded. A lot of times people want to be withdrawn from society. They don't want to have to deal with other people. Even if they're one of the most outgoing people normally, they just want to be left alone. And that is the cause of a lot of tension, because friends will say, oh, you just have to get out. You're usually you're the whatever of the party. You're the one that's always the one that is keeping us going, and now you just want to be locked in your house. Well, yeah, and that's frankly what the person needs at the moment. We talked about crying before. Sometimes people can be very restless. Sighing, like that kind of noise, just letting out that sigh is also something which is very common of grieving people. Some people can't get enough of the reminders of the deceased, and others don't want to have any reminders at all. And then we can also find ourselves searching or reaching out for the person in our dreams, or we could have dreams about them. And dreams are a whole nother complicated topic, which I could talk about for an hour probably. But it's very common, and I've personally done this myself, where you go to dial the phone or pick up the phone or on your cell phone or whatever and call the person who died, and then you go, oh my goodness, what's wrong with me? Like, why am I, those are very normal reactions, and it happens to a lot of people, and part of it is just because it's habit, and part of it is because we haven't totally figured out yet, and we haven't had the time to totally assimilate the fact that that person's no longer here. Spiritually, if you have like a spiritual life, people could get very angry at God. Why could he do this? Why could he let this happen? I prayed and prayed and prayed, and yet my loved one still died. What is God doing? Sometimes people don't want to participate in church services or what other faith denomination services that they're a part of, partly because it may remind them of the funeral, partly because they're just sick of seeing happy families together and they don't want to really be there right now. We talked about the platitudes like she's in a better place and other, I'm going to call them religious-like things, which are good for your spirituality but bad for your emotions at the moment. They may be theologically a good thing, or it may be even a faith-filled thought to have, but it doesn't make the fact that you're missing someone just go away overnight. Some people's prayer life, if they had one, gets stronger, and other people just say, forget it. There's no reason to pray to this God that took my 5-year-old son. I mean, how could he do such a thing? And I just like to stress that these are very normal reactions that I hear from almost everybody, to be honest. So before I end, I'm just going to leave it with this one slide here, which is an exercise that I tend to do when I'm running a group. And I use this because it's a good way to get a sense of how we're doing and how we're feeling. On this chart or on this table, there are, I don't know, 50 or some number of feelings that we can have. And what I ask people to do is to read them and then circle anything that you feel you're feeling today. So for example, if we were to do that right now, someone might say, well, I feel sad, I feel guilty, maybe I feel apprehensive. So you circle those and then put a star next to any one of those that you circled that you're surprised that you circled. In other words, you wouldn't have thought that you felt that way until it was in front of you and you saw it. The reason being is that it's usually the ones with the stars that are getting us that we don't even recognize. And it's a good way to get in tune with and in touch with the ways that we're feeling. I also have people, when I run a group and I do this, let's say once a week, I have this as the start every week. And the reason I do is because from one week to the next, some of them will be very similar, like sad might be there all the time. But some of them may be different. Something may have happened to you yesterday. Now all of a sudden, you heard some information that you didn't realize, and all of a sudden you feel guilty. And it's a good way, because when you start to see how you're feeling and you start to see how the feelings are changing, then you can help yourself, maybe in your writing or you're speaking with somebody, to say something to the effect, boy, I heard such and such today and I started feeling awful guilty. And it's a very good way to sort of get that poison, if you will, out of us. And so I leave this here for anyone who might want to, use this type of technique in their grieving process. So I kind of went through it in like 50 minutes, it looks like here. Sometimes this takes an hour and a half with questions and different things like that. And I know I kind of went quickly, but I just hope that some of this information helps you. I've learned that sometimes just hearing what's normal can help normalize other people into thinking they're not crazy, even though they might think so. I want you to know, whoever might be looking at this, I would continue to pray for all those who are grieving. And as I said, if you have any questions or want other information, I'll be posting other things on my YouTube channel. But at the same time, feel free to send an email to me at hdemina@gmail.com. So with that, I will end, and I wish you good luck, and my prayers are with you.